Good morning, all. Nehemiah chapter 3, where we begin this morning. Thank you for being here. Class number 18 would be the material that we're going through. If anybody needs material, we can certainly, Jeff can work that out for us. Class 18, Nehemiah chapter 3. We'll actually dive a little bit into Nehemiah chapter 2, where I got a little long-winded and we got cut off last time. But we will catch back up in Nehemiah chapter 3. Before we begin this morning, will you join me in a word of prayer? God, we thank you for the morning and all the blessings that you give us of this church family that we can join with on a beautiful morning. And we pray that we handle your word correctly and that the truth is taught in all the classrooms in this building, and there could be much good done, not just here, but all over the world this morning as Christians meet together on the first day of the week. And we pray that your kingdom is strengthened and that it can grow and can be the influence for good in this world that it's intended to be. Pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen. So we'll actually begin with the last question of Class 17 because it got cut a little bit short, and there are a couple of interesting things there that I'd like to point out. And so we'll back up just for a moment to Class 17 and question 5, and that was when we were talking about the opponents of Nehemiah, and they introduced themselves in chapter 2, and we're first introduced to them in verse 9 and 10, and then we get a little more description in verses 19 and 20. And so we touched on this a little bit, so we'll recover just for a moment. So who were these guys? Who were these opponents? And they will keep showing up as we go through the book of Nehemiah. Who were the opponents? So we're given 3 specific names, Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem. And what do they have in common?
Governors?
We know one of them's a governor. Is that all 3? Perhaps that's the case. I'm not sure.
2 of the governors.
Yeah. I know Sanballat is an official, it appears. He's some kind of official. Anything else you think they have in common?
Like the long-standing enemies of Israel. You have maybe presumably a Moabite, an Ammonite, and an Arab, which would have been an Ishmaelite.
Yes.
So, you go back to look at the origins of these countries, very interesting. So,
Yes.
Common enemies.
Common enemies, and just to back up a step from there, just to say the basic part out loud, they're not Jews. So we're talking about non-Jews from, as John mentioned, long-standing enemies. Horonite is kind of an interesting word. Did anybody, that's not one that we just instantly connect with a place geographically. Did anybody, what is a Horonite?
I looked that up. Is it a city in Moab?
So there's a Moab connection for sure. He's also referred to in a later chapter as a Samaritan, is there some mixed heritage there, or is there another Horon somewhere? I'm not clear on that. We know there's a Beth Horon in Joshua that would kind of be in the Samaritan in a northern kingdom kind of area. Anyway, one way or another, we know that these are non-Jews who, it says, we learn in verse 10, it displeased them greatly that someone had come to seek the welfare of Israel. It's pretty much all you need to know. It displeased them greatly. That's verse 10 of chapter 2. It displeased them greatly that someone had come to check on the welfare of Israel. And we touched on just briefly, let's answer the question first. The second part of the question is, what was their accusation and how did Nehemiah respond? We didn't get to that question. In chapter 2, what was their accusation in chapter 2? And it's in the very last couple verses. You're rebelling against the king. And if you had limited knowledge of the letter that Nehemiah brought and what his purpose was, could that accusation carry some influence? Perhaps, yeah. If you are, why do you normally build a wall? Protection and security. And if you are under the protection and security of the Persian king, why do you need such a thing? And so, it is something that you do when you are trying to insulate yourself, and it could certainly be taken as a rebellious action if you didn't understand where Nehemiah was coming from. So that's their accusation. How does Nehemiah respond?
He told them that God is behind them building the wall. Paraphrasing.
Yes.
That God gave them the right to do.
So God gives us the right to do this. And then he says something else. It might be construed a little bit harsh at the end of that chapter. What does he say?
You have no part in Jerusalem.
You don't have an inch in Jerusalem. You don't have a dog in the fight. Pretty clear and distinct about where he thought they belonged in Jerusalem.
Why didn't he pull out his letters?
Well, I think they'd already seen them, Miss Carol. I mean, I think verses 9 and 10 indicate that they were very clear on what his mission was.
I just thought they got that from the fact that they were building the wall.
I get the impression they knew the letters. They were just trying to stir up stuff at the end of the chapter with accusations they knew were not accurate. I'm open to suggestion on that, but that's how I understood the flow of the chapter. So if you, I'm not blaming Nehemiah for the relationship issues between the Jews and the Samaritans by any means, but you get some insight here into how Jews felt about Samaritans. This goes on into the time of Jesus. Several hundred years later, you don't have a part or right in Jerusalem. There's not an inch here that you guys have any interest in. It's kind of you kind of get the sense of that relationship. The thing I wanted to spend just another moment on is there perhaps a reason why these particular men, and we touched on this briefly, but I'll mention it again, is there a particular reason why these men were in Jerusalem and so interested in maintaining the status quo? There's certainly some evidence, in Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 28 talks about this with Sanballat. There is certainly evidence that these men, their children had married into prominent Jewish families. And so some of the intermarriage issues that Ezra dealt with and that Nehemiah will deal with, these guys are tied up in that, I think, almost certainly. Nehemiah chapter 13 and verse 28, one of the last things that Nehemiah says that he did was that one of the grandson of the high priest was the son-in-law of Sanballat the Horonite. You think about that. The grandson of the high priest was this guy's son-in-law. They're in-laws with the high priest. He's in with some prominent members of Jewish society. Nehemiah 13 and verse 28. He certainly had every reason to try to reject any Jewish reform. I'm sure that he had some status with the high priest, and that the reforms that might have taken away or dissolved that marriage would have taken away some of his influence and power in the area, for sure. Does that make sense? Any questions, thoughts about that? And the same is really true of Tobiah. And in fact, Tobiah, we know for sure he had significant influence within the Jewish community. We know that from chapter 6, and it's worth skipping ahead here just briefly as we talk about Tobiah. Nehemiah chapter 6. And this is even after the wall is completed. Notice what is said about Tobiah. Nehemiah chapter 6, beginning in verse 17. Moreover, in those days, the nobles of Judah sent letters to Tobiah, and Tobiah sent letters to them. There was a lot of correspondence between this Tobiah and the leaders of the Jews. For many in Judah were bound by oath to him, because he was the son-in-law of Shechaniah, the son of Era, and his son Jehohanan had taken the daughter of Meshullam, the son of Bechariah, as his wife. I'm not good at family trees. I had to read that 7 times. I had to lay it out to try to understand it. But essentially, there's layers of intermarriage here. That Tobiah himself, and remember, Tobiah was an Ammonite? Yeah, Tobiah was an Ammonite. He was in a marriage to a wife that would have been of Jewish lineage. So that would have been one of the marriages perhaps that Ezra was concerned about. And then his son was married to the daughter of a prominent Jew. So again, when Ezra came in with these reforms, as we read about in the end of the book of Ezra, these intermarriages with the local peoples that were causing such division and so many issues, that has not completely resolved itself. We still see these issues existing with these men. Does that help explain why they were so opposed to any Jewish reforms? I think it probably does. And one last thing on this, and I don't want time to get away from us, but it's very easy to look back and say, well, this is a good guy, this is a bad guy, this is a white hat, this is a black hat. I think as you read more of these verses, you find that the truth is messy and that people are messy. Like, I'll give you a quick example. This Meshullam, his daughter married a foreign man. Well, he's in the middle of a lot of the issues. And yet he's mentioned, as we're going to read in Nehemiah chapter 3, as one of the people that worked on the wall, this specific guy. But he's also mentioned at the end of the book of Ezra as somebody who was opposed to Ezra's reforms. Well, maybe this helps explain why. In Ezra chapter 8, he's one of the ones that stood up against, Ezra chapter 10, he's one of the ones that stood up against Ezra in these reforms. I say all that to say, as you can imagine, it was just messy. This is somebody who is listed forever in Scripture as someone who took action and helped rebuild the wall. But he's also someone who is a father-in-law to a pagan. It got very messy once these marriages begin happening within the Jews during this time. You can see that in families. You can imagine what all of this did to this family. These prominent Jewish families of people who were probably trying to do the right thing and wanted to rebuild the wall. It's messy. Just thought that was an interesting help me think about that differently. It's not always just as easy as the good guys and the bad guys. People are conflicted and families are messy. I think this is an example of that.
So, Michael, do we assume the ones that were entered into the marriages that Ezra was trying to get them to separate themselves from, if they were building on the wall, they had done this?
Had they separated the marriages? Were those who had built the wall separated the marriages?
The ones that helped build the wall, do you think they had put their wives and children away and turned to God?
Good question.
Or did God forgive them?
There are a couple of examples of men who are listed in Ezra who are also listed as building the wall. So I think that some, Miss Carol, certainly did that. Are we saying that everybody who worked on the wall was a good guy? That's dangerous, right? I mean, we wouldn't whitewash everybody and say they were all sinless and perfect. I think this is evidence that it wasn't that clear cut. It was just messy, and I don't think I have an answer for that.
But that's the way we are today.
We just happen to be messy also, don't we? Like, if we expect everything to be clear cut and there's white hats and black hats, life's not that way. It's messy.
As I told Freda, what I took from this chapter 3 is we can all do God's work.
Yes.
We do not have to be skilled.
They all did the work, didn't they? And we're going to talk about that. From a lot of different backgrounds and a lot of different places, and they all did the work. Yes, sir.
I think this definitely makes clear God's reasoning when Joshua led the children of Israel into the land to wipe all these people out.
Yes.
Because you see what they got into as a result.
Yeah, 1,000 years before, whatever it was, that failure to completely destroy these native peoples is still haunting the Jews all these years later. That's a really good point. I mean, we're talking how many generations later at this point, and it's still that stumbling block that they keep running into. It's a really good point. Okay, probably spent more time on that than we should have. Chapter 18. So, Nehemiah chapter 3, you can get bogged down in chapter 3, and it's easy to say this is one of these flyby chapters. I'm just going to fly by it right into chapter 4. But I think if we just trace some of the places that are mentioned, it's kind of amazing how much detail that we get from Nehemiah about the work. So I picked a new map, John. You convinced me to pick a new map. So we got a new map of Jerusalem. And the question is, can we note in the map some of the specific gates and places that were being built? And is there a pattern to the way Nehemiah goes about it? Counterclockwise. Yeah, he starts right at the north end of the city, and if you trace where Nehemiah is going, he really just makes a circle around the city in a counterclockwise way, very systematically, who was working on what portions of the wall. So let's note that. What portion is being worked on in verse 1? Sheepgate. So we kind of know the area that is, and we're due north almost. John, fill in here where I screw this up. Verse 3. Fishgate, we've worked our way a little bit west. And we also note the Tower of Hananel there in verse 1. So that's on this map. I'm not sure if it's on the map in your... yeah, it is also in the map that's in your lessons. And this is just the walls are expanded. The general locations of all these gates are the same on either map. What about what's the next one? Verse 6. What's that? Yeah, depending on the version, that one reads differently. You can read Yeshana, I think, gate, or ancient gate, or old gate. I don't have a lot of insight into that. I don't know, John, anything to add there? I don't know what I assume that we're talking about this gate here as we work our way down the west side. What about verse 8? There's a broad gate or a broad wall that's noted there. And it's also noted, where's the Tower of Furnaces? That's verse 11, right? Tower of Ovens, Tower of Furnaces, which I think they're on the corner.
So that broad wall was, and likely where the gate was in direct relationship to Hezekiah. So Hezekiah built that section of the wall for the...
We talking here?
Yeah, that's actually right where the broad wall still sits today.
Okay. So that there on that westward moving part of the wall, that'd be the broad wall, verse 8. And then this Tower of Ovens or Tower of Furnaces that's noted in verse 11 as we work our way around. Verse 13 speaks about the Valley Gate and who worked on the Valley Gate. And we read about the Valley Gate previously, right? What was significant about the Valley Gate? Yeah, so when Nehemiah made his inspection, that's the gate that he left and entered. Verse 14 gets us to the Dung Gate, or the Gate of Refuge, depending on what you're looking at.
That's right where the Kidron meets the Hinnom. So the Hinnom Valley, of course, is where we get Gehenna. That's where the constant burning of stuff was. So that gate still is there.
Yeah, so let's talk about that for just a minute. The Valley of Hinnom, just while we're there. So that Valley of Hinnom, John, help me here, but refuse goes out the Dung Gate, goes to the Valley of Hinnom. Corpses, refuse. Take it from there.
Well, constant burning. So the east side is the Kidron Valley. Further east is the Mount of Olives.
Yes.
And it actually meets, the Hinnom and the Kidron meet to form another valley right there at the corner where the Dung Gate is.
Yeah.
It goes all the way to the Dead Sea. That's right at that intersection.
And so when writers are trying to describe the place of eternal torment, the thing that's in mind is this constant burning in the Valley of Hinnom, Gehenna. But that's really what they're talking about. As we move on to the fountain gate in verse 15. Why is it called the fountain gate?
This is where the spring of Gihon was. So the spring of Gihon was, I don't know if it was still filling the pool of Siloam, but originally Hezekiah made it to fill the
Yeah.
pool of Siloam.
And then just a couple more, and you guys may have found more than I did, but the water gate is mentioned in verse 26. And then as we work our way back up the east side of the city, back up one. Verse 28 mentions the horse gate. And what else? The east gate in verse 29. And then we've worked our way all the way back up in verse 32 to the Sheepgate. So it's a pretty good mapping all the way around. I mean, did the work of Nehemiah really encompass the entire city? Very clearly it did. I mean, he starts at 12 o'clock if the map is a clock, he starts at 12 o'clock and works his way all the way back around, completely around the city. And all of the names that are mentioned there, I think Kyle in a sermon not too long ago talked about some of the significance of some of these names, that they're recorded for eternity as people who helped in the work. And can you trace back some of them? You can. Significant things about them. But we'll talk about a couple of those things. Anything else about the map or the gates that are worked on here? I just think it's interesting to learn a little bit about that history of the detail that Nehemiah leaves for us on the gates.
There's just a massive amount of engineering. I mean, this isn't going and throwing some mortar and stone together. So there's engineering involved and a lot of complexity. But I do think, as you indicated earlier, I do think that there was some remnant left. So these guys weren't starting from scratch. And so that he had some infrastructure there, maybe a little bit.
Yes. And we talk about a gate. We're not talking, you might, John, help us here, but I mean, we're not talking about a swinging gate that leads into my backyard. This is a little more significant structure. The size and complexity of the engineering of these gates, it's not something you want me and Dad to do.
Hold on here.
Sorry.
Well, there were certain types of stones that where there was logs that sat in these rounded stones and didn't let them, almost like a hinge, move.
Yes.
So
What size are we talking about roughly on some of these gates?
for these gates, it's hard to know. They weren't the Solomonic gates for sure. The Solomonic gates were huge. They were four-chambered. These I don't think were chambered at all, but they most certainly had the ability to open and close, and it would have taken logs to sit in a particular way for them to open and close.
Yeah. And then how are those fashioned within the wall? As it mentions in many cases, it talks about its bars and its bolts and what's the word I'm trying to think of? Its beams and its bars and its doors. Again, fairly significant structures. Anything else?
How big an area are we talking about?
How big an area are we talking about, John? If we talk about the entire circumference being worked on here.
I can't remember the specific acreage or square footage. I can't.
So are we talking, I'd be curious to know how many miles of wall we're really talking about. I don't have, good question. We'll find an answer to that one.
To walk around the city walls right now would take, an hour and a half. So it's actually smaller than you may think.
Yeah.
Just to walk along the Kidron Valley from the top to bottom would take half an hour.
Okay. Give you some idea. But we'll try to find that answer. Good question. All right, let's move on to question 2. So all the way back in verse 1, let's talk about the Sheepgate. Who worked on the Sheepgate?
The high priest.
The high priest and then the other priest also. Maybe a couple of significant notes about that. Why might that be significant?
That's where the sacrifice lambs came through.
Okay, so Carol notes a detail. Where is the Sheepgate in relation to the city? What's it close to? Yeah, so the temple is in that corner. Was it called? Did you find that detail? Is it called the Sheepgate because that's where the sacrifices came through? I was not aware of that. Yeah, that's very cool. So it makes sense that the priest would be working on that section of the gate. It is close to their workplace there at the temple.
In the New Testament, the Herodian temple walls have a sheep gate, and that is the gate that Jesus is said to have come through when he healed the man at the pool of Bethesda, which sat right there.
Interesting. Very cool. Anything else significant about the high priest?
Well, I think because he was a godly leader, and he worked, I think he led by example by working, and then he didn't act like he was too spiritual high up to not participate in the work of the people.
I do think, yeah, Judy notes that the high priest was not unwilling to roll his sleeves up and get to work is probably worth noting here. And it's one of the things, and the question comes up later, what changed? This wall sat here forever in rubble. What changed? Wasn't like the high priest didn't have the ability. Obviously, the people had this ability. Just hold that thought. Why all of a sudden is the high priest willing to roll his robe up and get to work? I think that's an interesting question. But we note that the high priest and the priests are working there in the Sheepgate area closest to the Temple Mount. The question 3 speaks to something that Carol noted earlier. How many different skill sets do you notice here in chapter 3? Anybody want to just read out or call out some of the different skill sets or groups that are noted?
The priests.
Priests is one. Yeah, that's verse 1. We know that, they're not priests because how handy they are with wood tools, but they're working, right? Who else?
The perfumers.
There's perfumers in verse 8, I think. Goldsmiths in verse 8.
And I assume these are politicians or government leaders. They said the leader of half of Jerusalem.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming these are like civil government leaders.
I agree. If you're talking about verse 16, and that's where I took that, there's ruler of half the district of Bethzur, and there's different leaders noted in verse 16. I took that politicians is the note I made. There's some civic leaders, again, didn't get in their position because of their handiwork with tools. They're politicians. So we got perfumers, we got goldsmiths, we got priests, we got politicians. Verse 18 says we've got Levites. Verse 26, we've got temple servants. Verse 20, we got daughters. Yes, working. Verse 32 says we've got merchants, business people working. So what's the significance of that? Why does that question matter?
Just to show you all the different people that were involved in this. It wasn't just a artisan that could lay the beam.
Yes.
It involved all walks.
Yes, I think it is interesting that you note here that from all walks of life, people came together to do this work. As Freda noted, it's just not the carpenters. There's perfumers and politicians. This is not their life's work, but they came together to help. What else is interesting as you read through that list? Were all of these people residents of Jerusalem?
No, they were not.
They came from communities round about. So this is not people just working. Now, some are, it notes, is legitimately working on the wall that's adjacent to their home. There's some of that. There's some residents of Jerusalem. But there's many that are not. So you definitely get the sense of a community effort among the Jews to do this work from all walks of life, from all social demographics, from all socioeconomic statuses, from different geographies. They're all coming together to do the work. That's pretty significant. Yes, sir.
Were they necessarily all Jews that did that? Because the Jews had a ton of money. They could have hired the people that they needed to cut the timbers, to haul the boards in, to, well, if you just think about the things that would be required to feed this many people.
Yeah.
Raising sheep and crops and all that sort of thing. You had to have farmers or people in agriculture to do that.
Yes.
It's amazing all of the infrastructure you need to support an effort like
The support services, yeah, good point. The support services necessary to support this. Were there non-Jews working on the wall? That's a good question. I don't remember running into any that are specifically noted, but maybe I'm happy to have a different thought on that. Did anybody read anything about that, or do you have any thoughts about that?
I didn't mean that as necessarily doing the work on the wall, but the support work
Yes.
was possibly some of the local people. They didn't care whether the wall was built or not, maybe if they could sell sheep.
Yes. Well, we know the beams. We know the beams came from the King's Forest, chapter 2, verse 8. So the timber, it appears, came from somewhere else. But I think that's very reasonable that there were support services being done. Well, Nehemiah had a pretty hard line at the end of chapter 2, at least against Sanballat and Tobiah and Geshem. So I don't know how welcome that would have been. I don't know how to answer that question. Good question. Any other thoughts on that question?
Well, with the amount of intermarrying that we see over here, I'd be shocked if there wasn't.
Yeah, that's good. Another good point. We like in our heads that this is real clean and these are all God-fearing Jews in good standing, and everybody was perfect and clean. And it's not reality, is it? Life's messy.
This is not an independent country. They're a vassal state in a similar way Jews were in the time of Jesus under the
Yes.
vassalage of Rome. So they didn't exactly have funds or the ability to do a lot on their own.
Good point. Although Ezra brought a few $1 billion. What happened to that? I think it's an interesting question. Where did that go? Is it in the temple? I mean, it's noted that it was intended to be for the temple, all that silver and gold. I don't know that, was this temple ever known as being that ornate?
Well, it had to be the most expensive foundation on the planet.
Yeah.
A lot of it went towards the foundation of the temple, which didn't really get built until much later.
Okay, question 4. There's the listing of things we just talked about. I think we covered all of those. In addition to all the geographies and all the social strata that these workers came from all walks of life. Question 4: how did Sanballat, I don't know, I may be butchering his name, attempt to discourage the work in chapter 4? We know what he did in chapter 2. Chapter 2, he accused him of rebelling against the king, changes his tactics a little bit in chapter 4. And then the second question is, to what extent were his attempts successful? So what did he do to try to discourage the work in chapter 4? And I think there's at least 2 different answers here.
He started out taunting them.
So mockery was the first one. In verse 2 and 3, he and Tobiah, I think is noted there. And some of that mockery included what?
He is in front of we spoke before, his brethren in the army of Samaria, so he's ridiculing in front of other folks.
Yeah.
To get their support for whatever
Yeah, so he's in front of other Samaritans. He's rallying support, and he's mocking the Jews. And note some of the things that are said. Look what these feeble Jews are doing. I think they're going to get this thing built in a few days and offer their little sacrifices inside the wall. It's really cute what these little Jews are trying to do here. like they're really going to finish this wall. If a squirrel runs up on the wall, it's going to fall down. They got politicians and perfumers working on the wall. I'm sure this wall is going to be great. You can just imagine the things that are being said. So it starts with mockery, verses 2 and 3. What else? That's not the full extent of it in chapter 4. What else?
Verse 8, they conspire together to come and attack Jerusalem and create confusion.
So it goes from just mockery into something a little more serious, threats of violence. Terrorism is what we would call that, if you want to define it. I mean, he's a terrorist. So these threats of violence. One thing that I found interesting here as we read through these chapters, I'm not sure I know the answer. Were there ever actually any attacks? We know they were planned. I'm not sure that we know, or I know the answer to that. We don't know we see any specific, like we know that they fought or they built with guards and with swords on their sides and all the precautions that are taken. Were there ever any actual attacks? May you have thoughts on that or read anything interesting about that?
With the speed in which they completed it, you would assume not.
Yeah. So, depending on what version, well, I'm going to wait till verse 5 or question 5 to get to that. So, we start with mocking, and then we get to threats of violence. And to what extent were these efforts successful?
Nehemiah prepared his people.
So Nehemiah did prepare his people. So I think this answer has a couple of questions. To John's point, it wasn't that successful because they got the wall built in 52 days. It wasn't a raving success, or they wouldn't have gotten the wall completed as quickly as they did. On the other hand, did the Jews find these threats credible? Clearly they found these threats credible, because there's pretty extraordinary precautions taken. One of the verses that I had a really hard time with, because depending on which version you read, it reads very, very differently. Verse 12, about those who lived in the communities around about. So I'm going to read the English Standard Version, and then I'm going to read the Net Version, because they read very, very differently. I'll pull that up so I can speak intelligently. So let's read the English Standard first. Verse 12. At that time, the Jews who lived near them came from all directions and said to us 10 times, "You must return to us." So if you read that translation, it reads as if they were so concerned in these communities around about, said, our brethren, our fathers and brothers are helping you with this wall, and it is too dangerous. You need to send them back home. I think that's how I read that if I read that version. They said to us 10 times, "You must return to us." I think that's how I read that. Again, maybe I'm mishandling it. But if you read it in a different version, so I'm going to read verse 12 in a different version, same verse. So it happened that the Jews who were living near came and warned us 10 times about all the schemes that they were plotting against us. That's wildly divergent. So I don't know what to make of that verse. We know that there were certainly these plots that Sanballat and others were plotting, but somehow it seems, if that version is correct, that people in these outside communities, perhaps who had more contact with Samaritans and other of these nations, kept warning Nehemiah that these attacks were coming, and he kept maneuvering people accordingly. And I think there's some reason to believe that, because it says, verse 15, when our enemies heard that it was known and God had frustrated their plan, we all returned to the wall and to work. So it seems like they have these plans, but they keep being frustrated by Nehemiah finding out where they're going to attack or what their plans are. So, as I answer question 4, did the Jews find the threats credible? Obviously, they did. They went to pretty extreme measures to protect themselves. But God, whether it's through providence of Nehemiah knowing where to put these people, or whether it's from getting informers to tell him where to put people, the efforts, we learn in verse 15, the efforts of the enemies are frustrated. Okay, last question as we got just a few minutes. What hardships were the Israelites willing to suffer to complete this project? So this is where I want to talk about some of these efforts. We talked about the lengths that Nehemiah went to keep everyone safe. Talk to me a little bit about what some of those efforts were. What did Nehemiah do to respond to these threats from the outsiders? Yeah, so we have to divide the work a little bit. There's some that are working and some that are guarding. And what's the verse that says some of them even had chains of mail? Verse 16. From that day on, half of my servants worked on construction, half held spears, bows, coats of mail, and the leaders stood behind the whole house of Judah. If familiar with kind of, in our minds, kind of medieval protection, a coat of mail, that's pretty serious. I mean, like, maybe if in our minds we're thinking about, well, these perfumers were standing out there with a sword and trying to halfway protect. I mean, that's a lot more serious than that. That is a fully armed militia of the day, prepared to protect itself. When you're talking about shields and bows and coats of mail, that's pretty significant. So what else in that? What other hardships are they suffering there in about that same section?
They never did even hardly rest or had to do a change of clothes.
Didn't change their clothes. A lot of these guys weren't going home at night. They're sleeping there, especially on the walls that were least constructed. I assume those would have been the areas that would have been most vulnerable, that we pile people in there. That's how I read verse, let's see, what verse is that? Verse 13. So in the lowest parts of the space behind the wall, I stationed people by their clans with swords and spears and bows. I take that to mean the walls that were lowest, which would have been most vulnerable. People were literally living there. They were sleeping in their armor. They weren't going home until this project was completed. So think about that. That's a pretty intense. It's not years. We know it's 52 days. This is a pretty intense couple of months. The threat of attack is credible. You're not changing your clothes or going home to see mama, and you're literally living in this kind of war zone environment day after day while working on this major construction project. It's a pretty intense environment that is described here. And in a lot of places, as Nehemiah notes, the work is spread out. You can't just concentrate everybody in one area. And so there's people all over this wall. This is, again, a pretty intense time that they thought this threat was credible. So it leads to this question. Again, this wall has been rubble for 100 years now. I mean, all of a sudden, we've got this groundswell of people from all different walks of life and geographies that are going through some pretty intense and difficult circumstances to get it completed. Why all of a sudden do we have this incredible movement to do this work?
Because God put it on their hearts to work.
Carol says God put it on their hearts to work. That's not fair, Jeff. We're not done.
No, we aren't.
Certainly could say that there was spiritual revival, but there's also political freedom that are given through Nehemiah that they maybe didn't have.
There's something about, to ask the question, how long has it been in rubble? And remember, how were the Israelites described to Nehemiah? They were described as just being in shame. Like, these people are just tail between their legs in shame. But, with a godly purpose and some godly leaders, and to John's point, some, there's national pride here also. That combination of things is pretty powerful. A godly leader and a godly purpose and some pride in their work. And all of a sudden, these people who let this wall lay in rubble for 100 years are willing to suffer persecution and potential violence to get it done. I think that turnaround is maybe something I hadn't thought about fully, but it's very, very significant. So that gets us through chapter 4. Thanks, everybody, for your thoughts, and we will move on to class 19 next time.